Well, we use we use offender behavior across all crimes. Across all crimes. One of the biggest things that we say is, behavior reflects personality. So when I go to the crime scene, or I interview somebody and I talk about offender behavior, or I recognize offender behavior at the scene, if I look at a scene and it's very well organized, there's not a lot of destruction, looks like the offender was able to maintain control. That tells me in their normal life, this is what we say, behavior reflects personality. In their normal life, they are probably very well organized. They are probably a little bit more intelligent. They take a little bit more pride in their own self and things like that. Whereas if I go to a crime scene and it's terrible, they weren't able to maintain control, or they do excessive damage for no reason. That gives me an idea that this person is probably not as intelligent, that in their own life they're probably not as organized.
Welcome back to another episode of SaltCubeAnalytics, a channel dedicated to analyze human behavior. My guest in this interview is Arthur Stephen Chancellor, commander of the US Army Criminal Investigation Division. But first, a word of caution. If you are of faint-hearted nature, then this interview is probably not what you're looking for, as we're discussing topics that might disturb your peace of mind. If, however, you are interested in behavior analysis in all its facets, and if you want to learn from Stephen's more than 40 years of experience in law enforcement so that you may apply what you learned in your own profession, then you're up for an interesting ride. Behavior, any behavior, reflects personality, which means that behavioral traces, and we are discussing what behavioral traces are in the interview, can provide a wealth of information about the characteristics of the person who left them behind. This in turn allows investigators to predict pre- and post-incident behavior of the perpetrator, and, in combination with victimology, to even predict the next likely victim. All of this is, as counterintuitive as it sounds, in essence, not only interesting in criminal context, but also in business, and is part of what I like to group under the admittedly simplified umbrella of reading people. There are very dark edges around our modern societies, and we can dispute what is causing them. But people like Stephen make sure that these dark edges remain on the outer periphery of what we consider our normal lives, so that it is only when disaster strikes that we even become aware of their existence.
There we go. Steve Arthur Chancellor. Do I pronounce your name correctly, Steve?
That's correct, but it's Arthur Stephen Chancellor.
Arthur Stephen Chancellor.
Yeah, I
and
just
this
go
is
by
important.
Steve. Yeah.
This is important because, as we will discover, you're also the author of several books, so your name is important.
Yes, correct.
Yeah. So, Steve, many thanks for doing this, especially seeing the fact that at this very time in your location it's about 4:30 a.m. I'm a little bit more in a luxury position. By me, it's 10:30 a.m. here in Amsterdam. So your iron heart discipline made this call possible at this early morning. On my end, I had a little challenge. We had an unforeseen construction outside on our house. So my office, which is on that house, is susceptible to the noise. So I had to, in last minute, I had to change the whole setting. But I'm very glad having you here.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
I have a bit of information about you, right? And please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, right? So first of all, you're still active. You are a supervisory special agent. I believe that's again back in the military, right?
Correct. I'm a civilian with the U.S. Army now. Yes.
Okay. You're also a fellow with the American Academy of Forensic Science. I would be interested to hear what exactly that entails. You have a master's degree in criminal justice from the Oklahoma City University. Of course, as former special agent for the FBI, you graduated at the FBI National Academy.
Yeah, the FBI National Academy is for for other law enforcement, not the FBI. I was never an FBI agent. The National Academy is a training program for other police departments across the nation. All send what they say is their top 5% to the National Academy to get specialized training. That's all that is.
Okay, so your main career, I believe, was in the military police, right? You started U.S. Army Military Police.
Correct. Military police and then Army CID.
That was my next point. Then special agent for the Army CID. So for those who don't know, Army Criminal Investigation Department, CID.
Criminal Investigation Division.
Criminal Investigation Division. Okay. Yeah. You were the commander of 3 large CID detachments, right?
Yes.
Then senior crime scene analyst. That's important for our discussion today. You were working for the Mississippi Bureau of Investigations on cold cases. Also interesting.
Yes.
Then you went back to the U.S. Army CID that's I believe what you're being today, right? Supervisory Special Agent and Assistant Operation Officer.
Correct.
Wow. And you co-developed the International Forensic Science Academy.
That's correct.
Yeah. If that's not enough, and I'm sometimes really surprised how all-encompassing the activities of my guests are. Yeah. You also have a trainings company. It's called Second Look Training and Forensic Consulting LLC. Right?
Yes.
It's mainly for law enforcement. Is that mainly for law enforcement or also for companies?
Yeah, no, it's we provide investigative training for law enforcement.
And now still some interesting things. So you wrote a number of books. I found, I think, 6.
Yes.
The first one is the Investigating of Sexual Assault Cases, which is already in the 2nd edition. That means there's demand for this book.
Yes.
Then you have a book called Crime Scene Staging. Another one, Death Investigations, also in the 2nd edition. Very good. And then, to my surprise, I found you also do fiction, yeah?
Yeah.
Of the troops and crossed pistols.
Yes.
Okay, so quite an active personality around your area of expertise. Right? Did I miss anything? I think you also have academic credentials, right? I saw somewhere. I have too many notes here now, but I think you have a master's degree in criminology.
Criminal justice, yes.
And I think over the academic route, I came across your name. Very brief the context here. So I'm still doing research on deception in 911 calls. And I found a research paper that you co-authored together with, I think, 2 or 3 other scientists.
Yes, from the...
in regards to...
Right, they were from the Behavioral Analysis Unit from the FBI.
Okay. So in regards to that research paper, I reached out to you. You said, well, it's not really your area of expertise, but crime scene staging and sexual assault cases are your area of expertise. And this is how we came to talk about those topics today. Now, from my perspective, I'm very much interested in the psychological side of it, right? So I call it behavioral traces, right? What can behavior tell us over the personality traits, character, living circumstances, status, power, dominance, etc., of a perpetrator? And just before I stop talking, before I give the hand over the microphone to you, just 1 or 2 examples in regards to behavioral traces. I saw a study which said that about 80% of women, when a man turns away from them with whom they were speaking, 80% of the women look at the backside of the shoes. Right? Now you say, what's that to do with behavioral traces? Well, it says something about the personality of the gentleman, right? Another example is that insurance companies in the US, they're using data as, for example, how frequently or unfrequently you and I charge our phones, because also that has indications in regards to our conscientiousness. Yeah. So that type of things are we putting under the umbrella of behavioral traces.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now I stop talking. I hand the microphone over to you. I just wonder, how do we do this best? So those 2 areas of your expertise, they're kind of overlapping. Yeah.
Right.
So we can handle them separately, or depending on how the situation goes, we just interchange.
Sure. Well, we use offender behavior across all crimes. One of the biggest things that we say is, behavior reflects personality. So when I go to the crime scene, or I interview somebody and I talk about offender behavior, or I recognize offender behavior at the scene, if I look at a scene and it's very well organized, there's not a lot of destruction, looks like the offender was able to maintain control, that tells me in their normal life, this is what we say, behavior reflects personality. In their normal life, they are probably very well organized. They are probably a little bit more intelligent. They take a little bit more pride in their own self and things like that. Whereas if I go to a crime scene and it's terrible, they weren't able to maintain control, or they do excessive damage for no reason. That gives me an idea that this person is probably not as intelligent, that in their own life they're probably not as organized. So it just cuts across the board. When we look at sexual assaults, what we're most concerned is not necessarily what the victim did, but tell me about the offender. What were the offender's actions at certain times throughout this entire incident? And that helps us kind of paint a picture of who the offender is. And based on that information, I can actually categorize the type of offender that we're dealing with. So it has application across all crimes, but especially in our state's crimes or sexual crimes.
In our correspondence, you wrote to me that you no longer call it profiling. So how do you call it today?
Yeah, today, we don't use the term psychological profiling anymore. It's criminal investigative analysis, or CIA, which we always think is funny when you see it written in a book. It's criminal investigative analysis, CIA.
Despite the fact I have found quite some research papers still on psychological profiling, offender profiling, etc., etc. There's definitely still a vast amount of research ongoing, despite the change in terminology. But you told me also the procedures or the methodology is still quite similar, right?
Yes, I mean we're doing the same thing. The problem is that the psychologists were somewhat distressed that law enforcement were using the term psychological profiling when they said, you're not psychologists, so you can't use that particular term. That's where it came from. So this just changed the terminology, but we're really doing the same thing. We just added to it over the years now.
There are a couple of things to be said about crime scene staging. And for me, of course, this is a relatively new area. I never thought I would talk about this topic with someone like you. So I did a little bit of research. But if what I saw is correct, there are three main crime scene stages, so to speak. Yeah, the one is the obvious one. That's the perpetrator. The second one is the family. Yeah, and to my surprise, I found the third category is the police. Right? So when you go into a crime scene, what is it exactly that you're looking for?
Well, in my career, I've done several hundred homicide crime scenes, so I know what a real crime scene looks like, and I understand offender behavior. So when I go to a crime scene and I start to look around, and I realize that this is not like every other crime scene that I've seen before. And the problem is that the people that are staging a crime scene, they're not real victims. So what they have to do is they have to use their imagination, or they have to arrange the scene from what they have seen on TV or read in a book. But what's always lacking is the emotion or the offender behavior. That's what's missing. So when I come to a scene, to me, it's at this stage of my career, it's pretty well obvious that there's something wrong. And then once you realize that it doesn't fit in with other things that you've seen in the past, that makes you start taking a closer look. And it's during that closer look that you can determine that it's a staged scene. And the important thing is, and this is one of the things when we teach this to the law enforcement is that there's not one single thing that you can look at and say this makes it a staged scene. It's the totality. So we're looking at the scene, and I'm looking at the victimology, which is a background of the victim, and then I start looking at the offender behavior and the forensics and stuff like that, and we put it all together, and that's how we're able to say this is a crime scene, and now I can tell you why it's a staged crime scene, because I can come back with the particulars.
Before we go into the details of a crime scene and a staged crime scene, again, relatively new knowledge to me. I just did some reading on research papers. How widespread within law enforcement do you think is the awareness about staged crime scenes?
It's becoming more. It's becoming more aware. What we have found is most of the detectives have seen a scene that has been staged, or a false complaint or something like that, but they didn't realize what they were looking at. They didn't realize that the same things that we're finding or we're talking about that they have seen. They just didn't realize what it is, and that's kind of interesting because we always start off our training class with we ask the audience, how many here are familiar or have had a staged crime scene, and usually in a class of 30 we'll have one or two hands. And then we make a very brash statement. We say, I tell you, if you've been working a detective more than 2 years, you've had a staged crime scene. You may not just have recognized it. And invariably, at the end of our course, we will have the students come up and say, I had a case exactly like you say, but I didn't, I didn't realize, what it was. I'm going to go back and take a look at the case again.
If we dive into crime scenes now, I'm not sure if they're typical examples, but is there anything that what you are be mindful of from the very start when you have this staging element in the back of your mind?
Well, one of the things that we look at is can we discern or can we tell what the motive of the crime was? Because one of the things that we have noticed in staged crime scene is either the motive is not very clear, so there's no real indication, or there may be multiple motives. Well, that doesn't really happen in a real events. For instance, some of the more famous cases that we use, we do a crime scene study on the John Benet Ramsey case. I don't know if you're familiar with that. Okay.
Yes.
So John Benet Ramsey is a very famous case here in the United States, but that has all the indications of it being a staged event. Because if you look, here's a 6-year-old that is murdered but left in the house, but there's a ransom note. So what's the real crime? Well, it's certainly not a kidnapping, because there was no attempt to get any money, and you're not going to get kidnapped, or excuse me, you're not going to get any money if the child is dead and left in the house. There was no evidence of a sexual assault. There was no evidence of really any other crime there. So we say, really the only crime that was committed was her murder. So when that's the thing, then you're not looking at an outsider. You're looking for somebody that's probably more closer to the victim. And we see that many times with excuse me, for instance, staged sexual assaults, that you have someone a victim that is found in the house and she's murdered. It's fine, and she's somewhat undressed, but there's no indication of actual sexual assault. So you say, well, this doesn't make any sense, because this is not, how the victim is portrayed or left is not consistent with what happens during an actual sexual assault, because the person that is staging the scene doesn't understand the emotion and all the offender behavior that goes into those kind of crimes.
These are, first of all, in the Ramsey case, the suspects were still on site, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah. We don't really kind of name names, but yeah, it was somebody a lot closer to the family or within that house, because it doesn't make any sense for somebody else to come in to take the child from her room and then bring her down to the basement and deposit it there, but then leave a note. All that stuff doesn't make any sense. And the note itself, the note is nobody leaves a 3-page ransom note.
I think there were some weird comments to a political group, and
yeah, right.
I don't want to I don't want to emphasize this case in
Sure.
particular. It was just an example. But the second example that let's just say we could assume there are, let's say, red flags which should be noticed by experienced
Correct.
agents.
Correct.
Right? But I'm sure there are many less obvious signs, right? And I think those are the ones which are more challenging, but also more interesting.
It kind of depends on the scene itself, so because everyone is a little different. When we teach, we try to use some of the more famous crimes to go back. Jeffrey McDonald case, if you're familiar, this is the captain on Fort Bragg back in the 1970s that murdered his wife and two little girls and tried to claim that unknown people came into the house and murdered. But there's a saying that it's always suspicious that when an adult male who presents the biggest challenge to an unknown offender coming into the house is only injured slightly, but everybody else in the house is murdered. That doesn't make any sense. We have a kind of a general rule that say, are all things equal? And in this particular case, it's not, because the injuries to him are nothing, slight scratches. But everybody else is brutally murdered. His wife was stabbed 20 or 30 times with 3 different weapons, but he has almost nothing. So it's we're just looking at that. Are all things equal? Are there multiple motives? We use Occam's razor. Does it really make sense? Because again, with Occam's razor, usually it's the simplest answer. Usually it's the simplest answer in nature. So, we have a whole list of kind of rules that we use, and some of them are pretty subtle, and some of them are very, kind of direct.
And if you go now really specific into a
Sure.
crime scene, right? You have only the victim, no other persons available.
Sure.
To make it a bit more complex, let's say it's outside of the family context, because from evolutionary perspective, if a female gets murdered, it's not the guy in the bushes.
Right.
It's very often the husband, the boyfriend, ex-boyfriend. If you talk percentages, way above 90%. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah.
Let's disregard that for a moment. You come in a crime scene and look for signs that are not as obvious as the ones that you already mentioned.
Yeah. Correct. And again, these people that are staging the event, most of the time, these are unplanned, which means, for instance, for the interfamilial type stuff, usually it's some type of domestic assault that has taken place, but the offender, the husband, has gone too far and has now ended up killing their partner or their wife, their partner, or whatever. So now they have to explain to the police. Well, they don't want to explain to the police that they had this fight because that was going to bring them up on legal charges. So now they have to think. And one of the easiest things that they think is, well, to make it appear as if it's a sexual assault. But it's very easy when you come in, you realize that again, they're not real victims of crime, so they don't really know what happens. So they're looking at what they saw on TV, but what they see on TV, of course, is not accurate. So you can go in and take a look at the subtle things and just realize that this doesn't make any sense. This is what you think happens, and as we tell the detectives when we teach this is generally their first murder, but it's not ours. So we know what we're looking for, and when we don't see it, then that raises those red flags that we have to come back and take a look at it again.
I tried one more time, yeah? Let's take the husband, the boyfriend, the ex-boyfriend, let's take this person out of the equation, and you come in a crime scene where you do not have a first-line suspect, and you still have, for whatever reasons, the inclination that this might be a staged crime scene. So what are you looking for from the outside?
Yeah, what I'm looking for in those circumstances is I'm looking for the offender behavior, and does it make sense? Is it consistent?
For example,
Well, for instance, usually what happens in a sexual homicide, we have a couple different things. One, there's usually evidence of sexual activity. whereas there may be semen or something like that. Many times there are foreign objects that are used, that are inserted into the various body orifices. The victim may be posed. We say the victim is posed in a sexually provocative position where they're trying to shock or offend society. Put him in this sexually provocative position that's degrading or embarrassing to the victim. But when we come to it and we see that that's not the case, then immediately we think there's something wrong. This is not this is not what happens during these sexual offenses.
Okay, so I think two things. First of all, we don't necessarily need to restrict to
Right.
sexual offenses, right? They're murder without
Correct.
without that. And then these clues, these examples that you mentioned, I consider them, well, maybe as a naive outsider, as obvious. Yeah, if a dead body is kind of posed, of course someone has altered
Right.
crime scene. Yeah. When in my naive vision, when I think about crime scene staging, the first thought that comes to mind is somebody did something, whatever that is, and tries
Right.
to hide his tracks and put the police
Correct.
on a different,
Yeah.
train of thought. That's my
Yeah,
naive.
and that's correct. And we have in our book, we've been able to categorize the different types of staging. So we use what we call primary, and with primary staging, that's exactly what you said. Whereas the evidence or the scene has been altered, added, or taken away to misdirect the investigation away from the true facts. So it's primary staging is a misdirection. You want the police to look somewhere else. The second type, as we traditionally see in the sexual assault, is what we call secondary staging. Now, secondary staging has nothing to do with the misdirection of the police investigation. It's more of what the offender feels. Sometimes we see his fantasy. Sometimes we see something else that he has to do for his own personal thing in the scene. So what we saw, they personalize the scene. They place their own personality into the scene, and that's a different type of secondary staging. And then the third time is we say tertiary staging, or what we call MO-related behavior. And this is something that has been altered in the scene that has nothing to do with misdirection, that has nothing to do with the secondary or the offender's fantasy. This is where the family or friends come in and they alter the scene. They may take down the victim of a suicide who's been hanging, to save the family from seeing the victim or something like that. Those we don't even really consider as staging because there's really no criminal intent.
And I think it's very hard to hide if someone was hanging, and even if you put this person down,
Yeah,
you
but
still can
yes,
see
but they still do. We'll see that many times in autoerotic deaths where somebody is hanging, but as a male is dressed in female clothing, and the family, to avoid embarrassment, will take off the female clothing and then put him in bed or something of that. There's a whole laundry list of things that happen in those incidents.
And if we move now from the actual crime scene staging to the deductions about the perpetrator's personality traits, societal status, education,
Right.
etc., etc.
So what we're doing is, and again, this is part of going through. You see all these red flags, and then you have to sit down and think, okay, does this appear to be a scene that is premeditated, or is it what we call ad hoc after something else happens? And the difference is with an ad hoc, this is something that is unplanned. So again, the domestic incident where it goes too far, you kill your partner, and now you have to stage the scene. Well, you're stuck with whatever you happen to have at the scene, and you're unprepared, and that's why those are fairly easy to manage. Because again, it doesn't really make sense. They tend to be very simple. But you also have the premeditated. Now with the premeditated, this is someone who actually goes out and plans the murder. So they have a chance to actually do research. They have a chance to really study. They have a chance to sometimes actually practice before they actually commit the crime. Those are a little bit different. So again, with the ad hoc, those are fairly easy to spot because they're stuck. They have to come up with a story that makes sense at the scene, what they're left with at the scene. Whereas the other guys, I mean, again, they can leave forensic evidence. They have they may have an alibi. They have put in place different items that are consistent. We had a husband that murdered his wife and staged the scene to look like a suicide. Well, the wife had actually written out several suicide notes. We feel, and some of our medical psychiatrists, forensic psychiatrists, feel that she actually wrote the notes but left them for the husband to find, to pay attention to her. And instead what happened, the husband kept them, and then one day when he was ready, he went and murdered her and then left the suicide notes at the scene. And it was in her handwriting. So again, what this tells us is one, it's a little bit smarter. Two, it's actually a premeditated event rather than a domestic incident that goes too far. But again, these are those subtle things that you have to kind of put together later on. And we always say you don't go to a crime scene and look at it and say, this is staged. You don't do that. You have to come back, put everything all together, and then it starts to make sense.
And to link specific actions on the crime scene done by the perpetrator with what I mentioned already, education, right, character traits, psychological profile, etc., etc.
Right. Well, you can tell, the guy that is more intelligent is going to have a more complicated story. And he's going to be able to maintain that story. Dr. Jeffrey McDonald, a captain in the Army, he's a medical doctor, so he's been able to say the same thing for over 40 years now. Of course, he's wrong, but he has retold this story, and he comes off so sympathetic. There's a big group of people in the United States that think he's been in prison all this time, has been wronged. So it's that intelligence that he's able to weave this story, and when he's caught in a lie, he quickly changes his what he's been saying slightly. So I mean it's a big challenge, for these smarter guys, because they can add to the story as opposed to some of the undereducated or less developed folks. They're not able to do that. So that's how you put it all together, and you realize, okay, this is the reason why this is not making sense.
I have a couple of lists here in regards to the profile characteristics of organized versus disorganized offenders, and organized are the ones, right, that plan, and disorganized in the moment. But then also there are, of course, differences in the crime scene itself between organized and disorganized. And I also found the interesting one, the mixed offender, to make it a bit more complex, right? There seems to be mixed crime scenes.
For the mix, that tends to be a younger person that hasn't quite matured up, or someone that is someone that is in transition, going from one crime to another. So they haven't really fully developed. What's interesting is that we use this same techniques when we are trying to link different events together to the same offender. Because what we have found is that if you go back and you look at one scene and then you come up to another scene, you're going to see very similar things that are going on. And it's this is where this concept of a crime scene signature comes in. Because just like your signature is different than mine, and you could always spot my signature, it's very unique. Same thing with an offender who repeats his crime. He's going to leave his signature, and some of them are very, very pronounced, and some of them are very subtle. It's just being able to go back and compare the different scenes together, or not even crime scenes, just interacting with victims. We're working on one. Cases where an online offender has a certain technique and what he does, and now you have multiple younger victims But when you talk to the younger victims, he did the same exact thing to find them, to recruit them, to groom them, and then did the same thing when he sexually assaulted them. And you can and it's all you're doing is using the behavior, and it all matches in all the scenes, and that's how you can match them up.
Coming back for a second to signature, because you brought it up. My understanding is, again, very limited understanding. Yes, there's a signature, but the modus operandi can change, exactly like you said, because perpetrators develop. They get smarter, they get better, they get more confident, but the underlying signature remains the same.
Because we say MO is a modus operandi. How they're committing the crime is the how. The signature is the why. So, because it's a how, it's a learned. The MO is learned, and it will change over time as they develop more confidence, as they gain experience. And it's subject. We say when you're looking for a serial rapist, for instance, expect the MO to change about every 6 weeks, because he's learned now to do different things. He's learned now how to properly approach the victim, or what to say, or how to better get into a house, or whatever. So you'll see the MO will change. The signature, however, is going to stay relatively the same. That also may change slightly, but the main thing is going to be there at every scene, because that becomes his signature. Again, that's they are putting their own personality into the scene. It's and that's how we're able to track it down. They're inserting themselves into the crime scene.
And coming back to what you just said, a perpetrator speaking to the victim, the way how a perpetrator speaks to the victim can tell you what exactly.
Yeah, for instance, this is one of the big things. Are they nice? Are they pleasant? Or are they directive? We will actually have certain, particularly the sexual offenders, that are concerned to make sure that the victim is okay and secured. We say that it's a power reassurance. They're trying to reassure the victim, and they're actually trying to make this sexual assault into a mutual pleasurable experience, if you can believe that. So when I hear those terms, are you okay? Am I hurting you? I'm sorry that this happened. All these are very important, as opposed to others that are very directive. They may be profane. They may be very terrible in what they're saying. So as soon as I hear that one, are you okay? And I'm sorry that this happened. Anything that's kind of reassuring, I know exactly the type of offender I'm dealing with, because there's only one who does that. So this is why listening to the victim, it tells us a lot about the personality. And again, once I know the type of victim, the type of offender that we're dealing with, then I also know what his post behavior is likely to be. I also know probably what his prior or his pre-offense behavior is going to be, and I know how to catch him. But more importantly, once I've identified the type of offender through talking to the victim and getting all these personality characteristics, because that's what we're using. We're listening to the victim, and as the victim talks to us, we're identifying these personality characteristics. That tells us the type of offender we're dealing with. Now I know the best interview technique for these guys, because each one of these offenders has a different interview approach and technique to use that's going to give you more information. It's really, it all kind of works together. It's kind of interesting. It's because it is the crime scene. You see some things, but then when you talk to the victims, surviving victims, you can really paint a picture of the offender. And again, once you know that, then I know how to catch him, and I know what his weak points are. Yeah.
You said so many interesting things now that I'm hard pressed to keep up with the questions in my mind. Yeah, but we can take it in a line. Yeah. So let's start. And again, we don't necessarily have to focus on sexual offenders in general. Yeah. So you have sexual offenders and you have crime scenes. Maybe for in both instances, you just said there are multiple types of offenders. Is that true for both scenarios, crime scene staging?
Yes.
Probably. And sexual.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's in.
Could we, very briefly, could you
Yeah, there's a
go through?
yeah there's a school of thought that says that the same type of offenders, and we have different categories in the sexual offenders. The same categories can be used for people who commit homicides. Same categories. And it's what we are seeing at the crime scenes. You can actually go back and say, you know what, this is this type of offender. And again, once we know that type of offender, even if it's a homicide, then we know what the post offenders post behavior is likely to be. We also know all the personality characteristics, so we know who to look for. The reason why this is so important, what we're able to do. And again, this is the whole thing of the criminal investigative analysis or the profiling. We're never able to identify one particular person, but what it's used for is to narrow down the focus of the type of person that we're looking for. Because if I'm looking for one type of offender, homicide or sexual assault, then I know I can push the other guys aside for the time being, and I can concentrate on this particular category. And that's really the value. That's really the value.
What type of offenders are there?
Well, there's four types of offenders. There's the power reassurance. There's the power assertive. There's the anger retaliatory, and there's the anger excitation or sadist.
Okay, so very briefly, we don't have to go into massive detail, yeah. But I want to go in this direction, yeah. So how do you identify, either on the crime scene or through witness statements of the victim, how do you identify those four types?
Yeah, it's so what we're concentrating on is the three important behaviors, and that is the verbal behavior. What did the offender say? What was the conversation with the victim? The physical behavior. How much physical force was used, if any? And then lastly is the sexual behavior. What if there was any sexual behavior? Those are the three behaviors that we're getting all these personality characteristics. And this is why it's really important when you talk to surviving victims, a robbery victim or someone that was physically assaulted. It is, what was the conversation and what was your conversation and how did he respond to your conversation? And then the most important thing is that that's the offender, but we also have to look at the victimology. And the victimology is the study of the victim, whether living or deceased. And what we're looking for is what was it that brought this victim to the attention of the offender. Because sometimes that's one of the ways that we can use to link these cases together.
I have victimology on my list to discuss. Yeah? But let me try one more time to be more specific. Yeah, the four offender types, right? Can you give an example of behavior for each of those four offender types that would link the behavior to this particular type of offender? One of those four.
Yeah, the power reassurance. This is actually the most prevalent. This is a person that has really no desire to harm the victim. They are seeking. They are usually intimidated by women in the normal daily contact. So they seek a victim with it they can maintain absolute control. Again, they have no harm. This is the ones that make sure, hey, are you okay? I might apologize. There are even instances that the offender may even give the weapon that they're threatening the victim, that they will actually give the weapon to the victim to show them that they're not going to harm him. So when you hear that, so I know exactly who I'm talking about. The next person is the power assertive. Now, a power assertive, we see this guy. He is very straightforward. He doesn't give requests. He gives demands. He typically doesn't use a lot of physical force unless he has to. But it's always what he wants to do, regardless of what the victim wants to do. This is a guy that we most often see in the so-called the date rape situations. where he decides that he wants sex and it doesn't make any difference what the victim says, they will continue on. Doesn't necessarily use force unless he has to, but he will. He also has some other personality characteristics. This is a guy that is very concerned with his physical appearance. This is a guy that would work out. This is the guy that would drive a nice fancy car, because he's all into that image, portraying that image of a macho man. Those are the power guys, and the power guys typically don't use a lot of physical force, only what's necessary. We start getting into the anger offenders, the anger retaliatory. The anger retaliatory, probably the biggest thing that you're going to see in those events are the physical force. This is a person that may select a victim and just pummel them, and maybe not even sexual assault, maybe not even rob, but just will simply attack them because they're dealing with an awful lot of built up anger. So with these guys, there's not a lot of conversation. There's not there's not a lot of really interaction with the victim, as much as they typically use what we call a blitz assault, which is the sudden attack or an ambush on the victim, giving them no chance to flee or offer any resistance. If it is a sexual assault or whatever, it's very quick, and then boom, they're done. That's the anger excitation, and the anger retaliatory. Now you're going to see this guy. He's probably been arrested before for bar fights. He's probably been arrested before for domestic assaults, because that's his personality. The last one, this is the most dangerous, and that is the anger excitation, or the sadist, because this is a person that is into torture. This is the one that doesn't want some quick encounter with the victim. This is the one that may kidnap, that may take him to another place, and then give the victim, hours and hours of torture, whether it's sexual torture or physical torture. And the interesting thing is, it's not, for these guys, it's not about the infliction of pain. That's not what excites them. It's the infliction of pain and then watching the suffering. That's the mark of a sadist, where they have inflicted or they've done something to the victim, and now they're watching them suffer. That's how they get excited. That's how they get their kind of enjoyment out of all this stuff. And those are your four main sexual offenders. Well, actually offenders, because we also see them the same thing in homicides.
So once you have, based on the behavior on the scene or based on victims' testimonies, once you have identified the potential type of the perpetrator, what's your next step?
Yeah. So once we've done that, again, because we know these offenders, so I know the type of work that they are probably engaged in. I know how to go find them. For instance, the power reassurance, the power assertive. This guy loves to sit in bars, and he has a weakness. His weakness is he must brag to somebody what he's done. Now, he doesn't say that I've assaulted somebody or I raped somebody. It'll be his sexual prowess, but that's his weak point. He will absolutely go out and tell everybody what he's doing to his close friends. The power reassurance guy, one of his characteristics is he has no pride in his personal appearance, none. So he's going to get a job that is really non-confrontational. He's more active at night. One of the things that several times I've consulted, and we've had this serial offenders, and I recognize that he's a power reassurance guy, and I said, look, what you have to do is you have to saturate a neighborhood, and you're looking for someone that is out walking or riding a bicycle between 10 and about 3 in the morning, and you need to start identifying them and then start doing some research, because this is what they're doing. They go out, they're very nocturnal, so they go out between 10 and 3 in the morning, and what they're doing is they're looking for targets. They're looking for somewhere to go. So this is how you catch them. We had one here at where I'm at right now. I said, you need to go. You need to pay attention. This guy's only going to be stopped when you catch him breaking into a house, or when he's inside a house. Someone has captured him then. And that's exactly what happened to this offender. He has over 15 incidences, and they caught him trying to break into a ground floor apartment. And yeah, that was him. For the anger retaliatory, you'll probably see him because he's been arrested. Again, he's been arrested before for some type of assaultive behavior. He may have had to go through court-ordered counseling or something of that nature. The most difficult one is the sadist, because the sadist usually they tend to be a little older. Many times what we found is these guys have never been arrested for anything before they start offending, and they also are much smarter than the others. So they typically do not do things that put them at risk. When we look at victimology, we're looking at the risk factors, and we can put victims into high, medium, or low risk for becoming a victim of crime. Well, there's something that goes together with that, and that is when you commit when you go after a low risk victim, the offender takes a higher risk. If you go after a high risk victim, the offender takes a low risk, which is the reason why so many serial offenders pick up prostitutes. Because it's easy. Prostitutes, if you stop, you engage them, they'll get into your car, and once you're into the car, you're basically at the will of the offender. So when you commit a high risk, when the victim is high risk, the offender is low risk.
I have a very concrete question. Coincidentally, I read that Ted Bundy, he took high-risk targets, right? He used beaches, etc., etc. The question I have is, does Ted Bundy's psychological profile match his high-risk victim behavior?
Yeah, because, but remember, Ted Bundy, again, was very intelligent, and that was part of his thrill. That was part of his enjoyment, was able to go down and pick these people up and get them away. Luring college kids on campus. He would actually go in and pick his victims on a college campus. But that was part of his thrill. And when we see that, someone that is out to do these high risk, we also know right now that it is much more intelligent than some of these other offenders. And that's one of the things that is kind of a marker for the sexual sadist, that they will in fact do these high risk crimes, but they're prepared. They're prepared. They have a plan. Ted Bundy, when he would search for victims on a college campus, he would put a false cast on his arm, and when he saw potential victims, he was carrying around books. He would drop his books, and of course they would stop and give him a hand. He would ask, "Can you help me take my books to my car?" Sure. They would go out into the parking lot. Well, his car is already prepared. He's removed the passenger seat of a Volkswagen Bug, a little Bug. So he's already removed the passenger seat. So she would go in, open the side door, put the books inside. He would then get a crowbar that he had placed behind the wheel, and when she rose up, he would hit her in the head, throw her in the car, and away he went. But that was his thing. He was looking for these high risk. To Ted Bundy, it's kind of interesting, because he said when he went to select victims, he wanted what he called worthy victims. I want worthy victims, meaning I want victims that somebody would miss. That was his challenge, as opposed to prostitutes. He said people that go after prostitutes, those are bottom feeders, because those are easy. I wanted the difficult ones, the ones that are smart, they're pretty, they're in college, and if somebody took them away, they would be missed. Worthy victims is how he described it.
Yeah. Maybe worth briefly to explain that Ted Bundy, what you just said about his statements, that did not come from formal interrogation, I believe. They came from scientific research, right? They spoke to him.
Yeah, this didn't come from police. He spent a number of years on death row, and he was interviewed multiple times by different police and of course by psychologists. And in the end, he spent a lot of time with a minister. We think all it was just a way to prolong his life because he was eventually executed. But yeah, so through all of his interviews, we gathered that, and they actually came. Some detectives from Washington State actually came out to talk to him about another serial offender that they had going in Washington State at the time. So they actually talked to one serial offender about another serial offender, and that's where a lot of this came from.
Okay. And if we cross over now to victimology, right? And it does not need, so the victim does not need to be a female. It can be a male, and it does
Correct.
not necessarily be related to sexual assaults. Yeah. So generally speaking, what's your view on?
Yeah, victimology is one of the most important steps in any crime of violence, whether it's a robbery, whether it's a murder, sex. I mean, it doesn't matter. Any crime of violence, and what a victimology assessment is that it's just a study of the background of the victim. It consists of factual information: your age, are you married, where do you work, all that kind of stuff. Those are all facts. You can't change those. Do you have a medical condition? Do you wear glasses? Those are all facts. How old you are, your family structure, all that kind of stuff. And then we also have a what we call subjective, and the subjective is where the victim's personality comes into being. Your victim's personality. Are you confrontational? Are you demure? Are you shy? And what we always say is that victimology is all about the victim, but we use it to tell us about the offender. Okay? So what we're doing is we are looking at the victim from the perspective of the offender. What makes this particular person attractive to the offender as a target? The other thing we use it extensively for is when we do like suicide investigations, or someone is claiming that they committed suicide. Well, then victimology is used to establish what is going on in their life. What are the risk factors for this particular person that would kind of motivate them to end their life? And again, we just did one here recently where we looked at it, and this particular person had absolutely no risk factors whatsoever. And for in suicide cases, it's you don't wake up one morning and decide to end your life. It's actually a process, and this is what we found. It's like there was nothing indicative in their victimology that would indicate that they had anything. Were contemplating anything about self-destruction. So that victimology has great importance for all crimes of violence, because again, Roy Hazelwood said it best. It says, "Tell me about your victim, and I will tell you about your offender."
Okay, can you be a bit more specific? Can you give us some examples of, I know I'm going on very thin ice here because I don't. It's the argument is you can't blame the victim. Yeah, and this is not the direction. Yeah.
No. This is not victim blaming at all. No,
yeah, exactly.
It's not victim blaming at all. And in fact, it's far from it. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to just assess what makes this victim more attractive to the offender. And what we try to do, for instance, again, there are three levels of risk: high, medium, low. Pretty simple. Your low victim is the best example we have is like a housewife, or somebody who's an accountant. They don't go anywhere. They don't do anything. They don't really use drugs. They're not involved in criminal conduct. They're home. They have a couple kids. They go to work. They come home. Those are very low risk because they're not out and about where someone can find them. Opposed to a high risk, the typical high risk. This is your a runaway. someone who hitchhikes, prostitutes, someone who frequents bars and gets drunk and gets into fights. These are all high risk because they are putting themselves out where they can run into these kind of people, or people engage in criminal acts. Well, when you engage in a criminal act, you hang around typically other criminals. So that makes you kind of a higher risk. The importance here is very difficult. High risk victims are very difficult because they have a chance to contact criminals all the time from what they do. But the importance is low risk. Typically, low risk victims are specifically targeted by an offender because otherwise they would have no contact with the criminal element. The one in the middle is what we call the medium. The medium is typically a low-risk victim, but where they are at the time has increased their risk. The best example is a housewife that is home, but decides that in the early evening, I need something from the grocery store. I have to go do something. So they get in their car, they drive down the road, and the car breaks down. Now they're on the side of the road, and all the traffic coming by, you have a chance to come into contact with somebody. So what you've done, what you're doing at the time has increased your risk. Or we see it all the time in the States where a family may be driving down the road and they take the wrong exit off the highway and they go into a very bad part of town. That's where the drug dealers or the criminal element is at. Now that whole family's risk has gone up from where they're at.
In which category, low, medium, high, in which category fall the most victims?
The vast majority of victims are going to be in the high risk category, simply because they're out and about in the criminal element, and it's a lot easier for criminals to come in contact with them. That's why most of your serial offenders will pick your prostitutes, your runaways, or something of that nature, because they're very easy. It's a high risk for the victim, but very low risk for the offenders.
Yeah. So what you're saying is the more people you meet, the higher your chances you become a victim.
Yes, correct. pretty much.
Yeah. And if we talk about behavior, very slightly, victim behavior, what are, if you can advise, what are any types of behaviors? I mean, except for, stereotypical behavior, what are behaviors that might attract the attention of a perpetrator?
Sure. So again, one of the examples we use, we kind of talk to the detective, says, okay, if you have a victim, what is the victim of choice? Is it somebody who appears to be shy and demure, non-confrontational, that has their hands full of packages or their heavy purse or something, walking down the road not looking at anybody? Or is it the one that's dressed in athletic gear, that's clearly they're awake, they're physically fit, and they're aware of their surroundings? Who's going to be the preferred victim? It's going to be victim number one, the shy and demure, because the offender is looking for someone that they can immediately control, that will do what they tell them to do and offer the least amount of resistance. Excuse me. So this is the reason why we want to look at the victim characteristics to say, well, again, what makes this victim appealing to the offender?
Okay. So what you're saying is most victims where the risk is the lowest, where the exposure is the highest, and where the victim shows signs of weakness. To encapsulate this correctly.
Yeah, I think that the vast majority of offenders are going to look for those people that they can control. Now you do have your Ted Bundys. You do have your Ted Bundys. He definitely wanted somebody that was bright and alert, because that was his thrill, to be able to manipulate them. To get them to do what he wants them to do without them realizing it. And it's all part of their thrill and their fantasy and everything. Power and control.
Yeah. Last question in regards to the actual profiling, right? And there are different names of it, and yeah. So first of all, where do you think is this? Can we call it a field? Where is the discipline of psychological offender profiling? You had another name in the law enforcement. Is it already quite advanced, or is it still in the infancy?
Yeah, criminal investigative analysis. Yeah, I mean it's come a very long way since the 80s or late 70s and 80s when it was kind of first developed. I think the leading folks right now are the FBI. They have a whole section outside of their headquarters in Quantico, Virginia, that deals with this behavioral analysis unit, and we work with them, all the time. And your law enforcement, other agencies and law enforcement are able to call them up, say, hey, can you give us a hand? Can you take a look at these, and provide us some investigative steps? Other states have gone ahead and sent their own people to some of these courses or training with the FBI, and they're able to come back and do the same thing within their own units. What's kind of a misnomer. And I got these questions, when I was a adjunct instructor in college, that all the kids wanted to be, these young college kids, they wanted to get out and be a profiler. Well, it doesn't work that way. This is, you're able to use this, but after years and years of experience and just different training. And going to a number of these scenes before you're actually able to start recognizing this, these type of behaviors and stuff like that.
I had actually interviewed Robin Drigg. I mean, FBI is a large organization,
Yeah.
so I'm not expecting you to know anybody. Yeah? But I interviewed Robin Drigg not so long ago. He was the former head of the FBI's counterintelligence behavior analysis program.
Yeah.
And I also interviewed. I had the fortune to also interview his former mentor and boss, Jack Schaefer, who is both a former FBI agent and an academic who actually did his own research on linguistic detection,
Right.
same as I did. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Steve, I have a personal question.
Sure.
With all your experience looking at the dark side of the human civilization, right? How did this, I mean, it's almost self-explanatory, but how did it mold your view on life, on your family, on human society in general? I know it's a compound question. Yeah? It's a good thing to do, yeah. But how did it shape you? All this,
Yeah, I mean it does. It has kind of an accumulative effect, I guess. I'm very fortunate. I learned very early on to kind of put all this stuff that I deal with every day. I kind of put it into an attaché case, and I leave it at the office. And then when I go to a scene, I always I really and truly take a couple of minutes and get my head geared up, and I go see it. I go see the terrible scenes, and I'm very fortunate. I don't, I seldom have the nightmares or the bad feelings. Although it is kind of interesting. When I if ever I'm at the doctor's office and someone opens up a pair of latex gloves and I get that first whiff, I will immediately go to I think of the autopsy suite, because I've been to so many autopsies, and that's one of the first things I remember is opening up the gloves, and you get that first smell of the latex, I can smell blood now. It's because I've seen it in crime scenes so much that when I go into a crime scene, that's one of the first things I will pick up. I'll smell blood. I'm not a bloodhound. It's just one of those things. So you just learn to kind of deal with it. What's helped me is writing some of the books and textbooks, because I want to. It's always been my desire to pass on. I mean, I've been doing this for about 39 years now, so I'm trying to pass on some of the stuff that I've learned over the years, and is very cathartic for me. It's very helpful for me to sit down and kind of remember this stuff, and it becomes written on paper as opposed to in my head, I guess. I don't know if that makes sense.
everybody has his own coping mechanism, right? And you have chosen a good one, which is why we're sitting here talking.
Yeah. Right? It's and I just want to, like I say, I started this law enforcement profession because I don't like to see people get hurt. I just don't like it. I want to catch the bad guys. So and I think the rape and sexual assaults are the worst crimes imaginable. So I really focus in on those to catch the bad guys.
I think you answered the question already, but I want to ask nevertheless. Would you choose this profession again if you could go back?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. We're a little different now. It's a little bit more dangerous over here in the States now with the law enforcement, but still, yes, I would do so.
Arthur Steve Chancellor, I thank you very much for your time on this early morning for you. Seeing the time, you have done exceptionally well. Yeah, my brain would not function yet. I really enjoyed this conversation, Steve. I wish you all the best for your future, and who knows? Let's stay in touch.
Yep, I'm at your disposal. Thank you very much for the opportunity. It's always, to me, it's always interesting to talk about this kind of stuff. So I appreciate it very much.
Thank you again.
Okay, buddy.
All the best.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching. If you appreciate the content, consider subscribing. It costs you nothing and helps this channel.